Welcome, everyone, to the next and final installment of the Evolution and Social Science Speaker Series for the 2020-2021 year. Before I introduce today's speaker, I just wanted to give you a little heads up. We are currently planning our activities for next semester in light of the continuing and ongoing pandemic. We're not certain we're going to have in-person talks in the fall, but we really do plan on having them in the spring. We're still figuring out what's the best thing to do in the fall. We might one more semester do a Zoom format, and as we've done this semester, target international speakers who we wouldn't be able to fly in anyways. So with that, I will introduce today's speaker is Gretchen Perry. She had a slightly different career path than most of us in academia. She had a full career in social work before deciding to pursue a postgraduate education. And when she decided what to do, she wanted to test some ideas in social work in a broader context. She applied for and received her PhD in anthropology here at Mizzou. Her fieldwork took her to Bangladesh, where she tested certain ideas about presence and absence of caregivers of different kinds, and caregiving from the mother's and the father's side in a social setting that is very different than the typical, quote, weird, i.e. Western educated, industrialized, rich and democratic country where most social work is done. Her research is a great example of what we aspire to here at ESS, integrating evolutionary theory and the social sciences, but also bringing practice to that theory. After her PhD, she had a professorship in Canada. Since then, she's moved on to New Zealand at the University of Canterbury, and today she's going to talk to us about the importance of grandmothers. Virtual or whatever it is we do. Welcome to Gretchen, and please don't give her too hard of a time. It is 5 a.m. where she is.
Yes. So thank you very much, Karthik. That's a lovely introduction. And I'm really excited to be able to give this talk. I think it's a real privilege to be a part of the ESS lecture series. You guys have some pretty heavy hitters on your roster, so it's wonderful to be included. Yes, it is 5 a.m., so I will try and be enthusiastic and coherent. So here we go. I'm going to be covering the topic of non-parental caregiving, particularly focusing on grandmothers. I'm going to be using an evolutionary theory perspective on this and talk a little bit about why that's useful. And I'm going to target some theoretical perspectives around cooperative breeding, inclusive fitness, the grandmother hypothesis, and matrilateral bias model. And I'm going to be including in this a whole discussion of predominantly my research, but other research as well, to sort of fill out why those perspectives are useful for me as a social worker. And finally, I'm going to be looking at connecting theory to practice, looking at, as somebody who has worked and is an associate professor in a social work department, how I bring that theoretical approach to practice. Karthik mentioned very briefly that I had a career in social work prior to going back to school and doing my PhD in cultural anthropology. And I want to start there really because I think having an understanding of the context of why I was struggling within that practice environment and why I needed a PhD and why I did the PhD where I did. So there are two places in my career that I was doing assessments on families who were planning on providing care to adults or children with complex or special needs. And so I had to assess them and determine whether they would be appropriate fit for the people they were intending to provide care for. And particularly in the child welfare circumstance, we were talking about people who were going to be fosterage or adoptive caregivers, and that might have been extended kin family. Now, the assessment models that we were using and the tools we were given had been developed for stranger foster and adoption assessments. So they did not include the whole concept of extended family caregiving at all. And they were developed within a context where really there was no cultural perspective. It was just assumed that the dominant culture was the one that you would be working with. Now, my background is in Canada, in Southern Ontario, where it's extremely multicultural. And to be able to understand extended family context within a cultural milieu was essential to understanding how to assess those families and see whether they would be effective or not in meeting the needs of particular children. So in light of that, I didn't feel like the tools I had met the needs of what I was being asked to do. So I started to look into that myself, and it became apparent that there wasn't a lot of good research out there about this issue. That's what brought me to wanting to do a PhD in cultural anthropology on non-parental caregiving. One of the real benefits of the University of Missouri program is that it is focused on evolutionary theory. And it's one of the things that really inspired me to do my PhD there and in a cultural anthropology program. And I think it's really useful for the type of work that I do. And so I'm going to start with some very basic review of evolutionary theory and try and link it up for you to why I think it's so relevant to my area of interest. So evolutionary theory focuses on the evolved physical, psychological, and behavioral attributes that promote Darwinian fitness and how they evolved. The primary avenue by which people and other creatures promote their fitness is by producing viable young who will eventually reproduce. Parental motives, emotions, and actions are therefore prime targets of natural selection. And the whole concept of parenting is a key element in evolutionary theory and adaptations and how we understand the raising of children. But we need to keep in mind that much behavior is based on emotions, and that emotions have evolved to facilitate fitness-promoting responses to the physical and social environment. So we have hopefully a fairly accurate understanding of the context that we're in, and our emotions are responding authentically to those experiences. And that emotions such as empathy, love, jealousy, fear, and anger have direct impacts on who we want to be with, who we're interested in supporting, and how we care for other people or not. So these are clearly relevant to parenting. Now, I'd like to illustrate the importance of emotions in this process. So I'm going to show you a couple of pictures, and I want you to just acknowledge your first reaction. So here we have hopefully what you think is a lovely picture of a woman holding an infant. I'd be surprised if any of you felt extreme disgust or anger at looking at this. There's probably fairly warm feelings, tender feelings, a sense of relaxation and calm. Now let's look at this other picture. Again, you're probably all having fairly similar reactions. Some of you might be feeling quite stressed or tense. You might even be feeling like there's a need or sort of an impetus or motivation to try and intervene. And I think these are common reactions to seeing children in different contexts. So I think the point here is that humans are primed by our emotions to care for babies. But it's important to keep in mind that childcare is not indiscriminate. We don't necessarily respond the same to any baby that we see. The evolved psychology of childcare decisions has been designed by natural selection to promote the fitness of decision makers by improving the survival and well-being of their children. So there should be a difference between how we feel about our own kids versus somebody else's. And this is where we get to the whole concept of alloparental caregiving. There's a difference between parents and non-parents in their caregiving of particular children. And alloparental care is just non-parent caregiving. And this can be understood in terms of communal or cooperative breeding. And I'm going to be talking about this a little bit more, and I think it's worth defining what I mean by that. And this is a little bit complicated. Sometimes when we talk about cooperative breeding, it's been defined by a reproductive strategy in which most of the females of a social group do not breed regularly and instead provide alloparental care to the offspring of breeding females. And here we've got an example of meerkats, and some of you may be familiar with the BBC series on meerkats, which was quite popular. And it really demonstrates that style of cooperative breeding. But that's not really what I'm talking about, although sometimes people are described as cooperative breeders. Communal breeding is another term that gets used, and it's characterized by shared care of offspring produced by more than one female. And here I've got a picture of a pukeko, which is a New Zealand bird, actually. And in some circumstances, they're interesting in that multiple females will lay eggs in the same nest, and multiple females will then incubate those eggs. And so that would be an example of this sort of communal breeding. But again, that's not really what we're talking about with people. Then we have another definition here where they use cooperative or communal breeding as a common term where you can use either. And they describe that it occurs more when more than two birds of the same species provide care in rearing the young from one nest, sort of like what I talked about with the pukekos. There are two types of cooperative arrangements: those in which mature non-breeders, helpers at the nest, help protect and rear the young, like those meerkats, but are not parents of any of them, and those where there is some degree of shared parentage of offspring, again, the pukekos. So cooperative breeders may exhibit shared maternity, shared paternity, or both. Again, these are very much animal models. They sort of fit for people, but not really. But I prefer this definition that's being put forward by Karen Kramer, where she uses the term cooperative breeding to refer to a parenting and social system in which non-parental members of the social group help support offspring. And a typical example of this is the Florida scrub jay, where in difficult circumstances or dry years, the birds who have not been able to find their own territory remain with their parents and help raise the next brood of chicks. And so they stay and do that helper at the nest work. And this type of cooperative breeding is very much like this other type of animal, us. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about cooperative breeding in human beings from here. But it should be noted that a lot of these animal situations really inform a lot of the background in how we approach understanding alloparental care in human beings. So why do helpers help? Why would a non-parental caregiver help assist with somebody else's child? Well, Cletton-Brock talked about this and suggested 4 reasons. Cooperative behavior may have direct benefits to the helper's fitness, and any effects on other group members may be coincidental. Or group members are coerced into cooperating through harassment or threat of punishment or eviction from dominant breeders. Or cooperative behavior being directed mainly at kin is maintained through its effect on the indirect component of inclusive fitness. Or finally, helping may have evolved through a mutualistic benefits shared by all members of large groups. So any of these could fit for people as well. But in terms of the human context, there are challenges and questions to how good a fit evolutionary theory is. For instance, if our motives and emotions have evolved to promote our personal reproductive success, how could caring for somebody else's child, meaning non-parental caregiving or alloparental care, have evolved? Well, we've talked a little bit that inclusive fitness might be the answer to that. But human beings are more complex than that. We have lots of different cultural and environmental contexts that we live in. So how could sort of a singular, evolved common human nature exist that supports non-parental caregiving in the varied environments that we find ourselves in? And I'm going to talk about that a little bit in a minute. But there's also something quite peculiar about human beings. We have multiple dependent children at the same time with short interbirth intervals when we compare us to our closest 8 relatives. So what I mean by that is when you look at chimps and bonobos and gorillas, for instance, They have a child, they raise it to independence before they have another child. And often the interbirth interval is really like 8 or 9 years. Whereas for human beings, we have a child, they're weaned in a few years, and very quickly after that, we have another child that's also dependent, but at a different developmental phase while we have a child who's an infant. When we think of other animals that have multiple infants at the same time, it's usually a brood or a clutch of eggs where the development of those babies is occurring consistently. So the efforts required to raise them are happening within the same chronological time frame. Again, this isn't what happens for human beings, and the human experience is really the most resource demanding in terms of raising children. So how does this happen? Well, we know that in different cultures, there's lots of different circumstances, there's lots of different subsistence demands that are put on families to manage that. But there are cross-cultural, consistent ways of addressing that, and I want to talk about those now. For instance, there's extended family caregiving, step parenting, and friends who provide care, and in the modern world, formal child care providers even. So I'll go through some explanations here because they vary. We've talked already about this idea of inclusive fitness. The closer the relative, the greater likelihood they'll be willing and committed to provide non-parental care. So if I'm related to my sister quite closely, I'm also related fairly closely to her children. So I have some genetic skin in the game, as it were. So I should be, in that sense, committed and willing to provide support because it is also beneficial to me through inclusive fitness benefit. When we look at step parents, we're looking at a commitment between the partners themselves more than the children that may come along with those partners. So when people are looking at step parenting, they first connect and develop a relationship with their partner. And over time, they might develop an affectionate relationship between the step parent and stepchild, but that's not a given. And in fact, it's a risk factor for harm compared to other caregiving environments. And finally, the explanation for why friends might provide support is reciprocity, that give and take between friends. So I might help my friend with childcare, and they have play dates with my child going over and those sorts of things, and that helps each other manage the childcare demands. But this is quite different from other forms of care and requires a pretty quick turnaround time. So if my friend always wants help, they're always bumming $20 from me, dropping their kids off, asking for a ride, and not providing anything in return, they're not going to be my friend for very long. It requires that reciprocation. And we look at the modern context, that really gets developed into formal childcare systems where there's clear contracts of what's being provided, when, what frequency, what's involved, and that there's a payment on a particular schedule. And if I don't pay, I don't get the childcare. So those are some of the reasons why we would be finding that non-parental caregiving occurs. But I mentioned before that the demands of childcare in human beings is really high, and I would argue in some ways higher than for any other animal. What we find, though, in traditional societies where human beings evolved, that babies are typically born into groups that consist largely of close relatives. So we're looking at high levels of inclusive fitness. And the people who are most attentive in those traditional societies, these are environments where, we've got hunter-gatherers or agriculturalists. We're not talking about formal social systems being available. So those non-formal systems, those extended family, step parents, and friends are going to be key caregivers. But those who provide the most attentive care are grandparents, followed by aunts and older siblings. So what does this look like in more modern and weird countries, as Karthik described? Well, I'm going to give you the example of my own research here. I mentioned I had a career in child protection, and that's where I began doing my research. In that child protection context, I looked at different forms of fosterage, out of home care. So I'm looking at a circumstance where children are not living in their parents' care. They've been removed from their parents due to child protection reasons, and they're being cared for by either extended family or kin caregivers, by stranger foster parents, or in group homes. So I compared those three categories of caregiver in a very particular way. I looked at the placement stability, meaning how long do those placements remain intact over time? That was an outcome measure that I chose because it's an important indicator of child well-being in the short and long term. So I'll just show you this figure. It's fairly straightforward. We have the percentage of placements remaining intact along the y-axis, and across the bottom is time, stretching out to a year. And we have those three different categories of kin, foster, and group home. And what you can see is that kin placements are remaining intact for a longer period of time. Those foster and group home placements are dropping away much more quickly. So we see a persistence or a resilience in those kin homes. And this really reinforces the idea that inclusive fitness seems to be, or this is certainly support for the idea that it seems to be providing rigor to these placements. I also looked at, within that kin category, who provided the most care. So looking at counts or frequency of who of kin were providing care. And here's a very basic figure broken down by grandparents, aunts and uncles, and other relatives. And what you can see is the lion's share of care is being provided by those grandparents, very consistent with what we see in other literature with those more traditional societies, again, showing the support for the evolutionary perspective. We know that grandmothers provide a significant amount of care, and Kristen Hoggs is somebody who's proposed the grandmother hypothesis as something that I'm going to describe here. What she noted in her work with the Hadza, which is a hunter-gatherer society in Africa, that grandmothers are often more efficient food producers than other adults and their adult daughters, meaning they're able to be very effective in producing far more calories than they themselves use. And they're committed, competent childcare providers. They're these experienced, skilled parents and child caregivers, despite the fact that they no longer have dependent children themselves. They remain robust in these important domains. And she felt, having noted this, that natural selection has designed human grandmothers to be specialized non-parental caregivers. She was really looking at what was this explanation for this long post-reproductive effectiveness in provisioning and childcare capacity. We know from her research and the research of others that the contribution of grandmothers enable younger women to have multiple dependent children of varying ages at the same time. And this is one of the challenges that I identified earlier. How do human beings manage this? Well, we know that grandmothers are coming forward and providing this care. They can support their daughters successfully raising more children. They're closely related to their own daughters, and so more of their daughters raising more children amplifies the inclusive fitness of these grandmothers. And even though menopause stops women being able to have more of their own children, they are able, because of their great capacities, to invest in the care of multiple grandchildren and have a positive impact on their well-being. So this long post-reproductive lifespan allows for greater inclusive fitness. So I think the grandmother hypothesis really underpins why these grandmothers are so present in non-parental caregiving. But we also know that there are important other extended family caregivers that I've identified to some degree. And many of these are as equally related as grandparents to grandchildren, or even more closely related. So with aunts and uncles, they're the same as grandparents at 0.25 relatedness, but they're a similar age as a parent, their sibling who's also a parent. So they're likely to have their own dependent children who they're more closely related to than their niece and nephew. And they have a partner who's the direct parent of their own children, but has no relatedness to the target niece or nephew. So there's some divided focus here. The priority is their own children rather than their niece and nephew. And when we look at older siblings who are actually more closely related than grandparents or aunts and uncles, we can see that because of their age, maturity, and own dependency needs, they don't necessarily have the capacity to provide the intensive care or resourcing that a grandparent would be able to provide. They do provide important child care for younger siblings, but often this is intermittent and not as intensive. And they just have more limited resources because of their age and stage compared to independent adults. And to be honest, in many circumstances, they're actually competing for resources within the family. So again, we have the divided capacities or energies here that make them less likely to be able to provide the care that a grandparent would. What's interesting in the research when you look cross-culturally, and this is around the world in very different cultures, we find a matrilateral bias in supporting children. What I mean by this is that mother's family or the matrilateral family provide care much more often than father's side of the family or the patrilateral family. And when we have data on this, what we find is mother's family actually has a greater benefit for child survival, well-being, and educational attainment compared to father's kin. So not only do they provide more care, but it's more effective in having positive outcomes for kids. And Rebecca Sear, along with Ruth Mace, did a really nice cross-cultural review of this, looking at maternal grandmothers as well as others. And she found that they provide generally more helpful care that results in better child survival than paternal grandmothers. And in fact, in some circumstances, paternal grandmothers had a negative impact on child survival. So this matrilateral bias is something that really needs to be taken into consideration when talking about non-parental caregiving. And it does raise the question of why would a woman invest more in her daughter's children than her son's children? And for many evolution-minded people, the reason that has been given is that it's paternity uncertainty. Mom is baby, papa's maybe. So the expectation is because women know the children are their own, she and her family are going to be much more committed. There's more clear inclusive fitness. But the rates of infidelity and cuckoldry really aren't that high, even when we look at ancestral environments. And I felt that there was more to this story. And in a model that I developed with Martin Daly, one of the things that really struck me was that when grandmothers provide care, grandchild care, they're helping not only the grandchildren, but also the mother. There's benefits that happen at both levels there. And when a mother's being helped, that allows her resources to not just invest in the child, but invest more broadly. So we can look at where that investment from the mothers can go and who that might benefit. So when we look at a grandmother investing in a particular woman, we can see that the woman's efforts can go towards investing in a child from the current partner. This benefits both her mother and her mother-in-law, or the maternal and the paternal grandmother. But when we look at that same woman investing in children of a former partner or a future partner, it benefits her mother's inclusive fitness, but does not help the mother-in-law's inclusive fitness. If that same mother invests in her siblings or niece and nephews or matrilateral cousins or other more distant matrilateral relatives, again, there's an inclusive fitness benefit for her mother, but not the mother-in-law. And when we consider patrilateral cousins and distant kin, it really has no inclusive benefit for either. But what you can see again is that the lion's share of inclusive fitness benefit from investing in a daughter goes to the mother. Investing in a daughter-in-law doesn't give you the same inclusive fitness benefit. So let's look at the research again. And here I'm going back to that child protection setting. And I'm going to give you those kin that we looked at before at the frequency of them coming forward, breaking it out by maternal versus paternal relatives, white being maternal, black being paternal. And again, you see the dominance of grandparents providing care, but it really is those maternal grandparents providing care, and the vast majority are maternal grandmothers. Others is much less frequent, and we see a strong maternal bias. Now, I'm going to show you another placement stability slide here. And I just want to explain, this is a little bit different than the other slide that looked at placement survival over time. Here, I'm not looking at placements ending for any reason. I'm looking at placements ending due to breakdown. So placements can end because kids, parents improve their situation, kids are returned home. That's what we want in child protection settings. Or kids are adopted and have permanency. Again, these are positive reasons for a placement ending. But if a placement breaks down where the caregivers just say, I can't take this kid anymore, get them out of here, or the kid runs away or ends up being incarcerated, those are not good reasons for a placement ending. That's called placement breakdown. So if we compare maternal family versus paternal in placement duration by breakdown, I looked at that as a regression of Croc's proportional hazard model, looking at the probability of placement survival over time, controlling for a series of things, health of the caregiver, age of the child, income, things of that nature. And so we have the probability of placement survival over time, black line being maternal family, gold being paternal. And you can see that maternal family are surviving much longer than paternal. And in fact, when you look at that hazard ratio, it's more than twice the likelihood that paternal family are going to break down than maternal. So again, we see important support for maternal family, as you would expect based on evolutionary theory. Now, Karthik mentioned my work in Bangladesh, and I want to talk a little bit about this as well. The reason I chose Bangladesh is because it provides an interesting window on a very different cultural environment where there's different pressures and different opportunities for non-parental caregiving. So in Bangladesh, it's a society, particularly where I was in this rural area, of being patrilineal and patrilocal. What that means is that when women get married, they move to their husband's extended family compound, where a senior couple would have their sons' wives and children and other dependent people living together in one compound, working usually a rice paddy together as a joint family. This means there's a separation between a woman and her family of origin, or the matrilateral side of the family. So I wanted an understanding of, in this context where there's a separation from maternal family, do we see different things going on in terms of non-parental care? So I'm going to show you some results here. So in terms of where women are residing, this pie chart just shows where they were, whether it was with mother's family, this is the blue pie piece, whether it's father's family, the orange pie piece, or neither, meaning neolocal. This is where the husband of the woman starts his own bari, or they're renting in a non-relative bari. And what you can see is almost half of the families are living in the paternal bari. And most families at some point live in the paternal bari, but often over time they end up moving into their own. We see that smallest portion being maternal family co-residence. But when we look at the specific scenario of where mom is still the primary caregiver, but this is who she identifies as the person most commonly providing supportive childcare. And what we see is the portion of maternal grandmothers is slightly bigger than the frequency of actually residing within the maternal bari. We see that the maternal grandmother actually provides that primary caregiving far less often than the co-residents would suggest. And when she lives with neither maternal or paternal bari, those friends provide more than half. So we see a difference in who's actually providing the predominant non-parental support versus where women live. But one of the things that I mentioned before was that there's been ample evidence that cross-culturally, better outcomes are associated with maternal grandmothers providing care. Is that the case of what we find in Bangladesh? And here's a slide that gives us a window onto that. Now, it's a little bit of a complicated data portrayal here, so I'll work you through it. On that y-axis are standard deviations, and you'll note that they're all negative. And the reason being is, on average, children in Bangladesh are underweight and short compared to the World Health Organization normative standard. And they're also, when you look at education, this is based on expected education for age. And generally speaking, children in Bangladesh are behind in their education. This is a very poor area. Families have to pay for education, so children aren't always attending as frequently as you would expect. But this figure breaks out whether the maternal grandmother is the person identified as providing the most non-parental care, or the paternal grandmother providing the most maternal care, or anybody else identified as providing the most non-parental care. And what you can see is the deficits are much lower if maternal grandmother is providing care. If it's paternal grandmother, she really looks no different than any other caregiver in providing care. So there does seem to be a significant benefit, even in the Bangladeshi data, of maternal grandmothers having a significant benefit in child outcomes. So what types of grandparents are most helpful? And, this is sort of drilling into that grandmother versus grandmother perspective a little bit more. And Martin Daly and I did some research on this on a data set in Europe. This is the survey of health, aging, retirement in Europe. And here, this particular data focuses on 20 European countries. And what we found was consistent with a lot of other researchers, that grandmothers provided more care and more frequent care than grandfathers, that maternal grandmothers provided more care than paternal, and that if they had more resources, meaning better income, were of a younger age, of better health, and had fewer competing dependents, then they provided more care than if they didn't or weren't. But we also found another category that was important, which was different from what other people found, other researchers found, and that was related to relationship status. When we controlled for resources, age, health, and competing dependence, what we found was that divorced grandmothers actually provided more care than grandmothers that were married. What was interesting, though, was that grandfathers, their care when they were divorced dropped dramatically. If you took grandparents together, there was a net moderate drop. But because we divided out grandparents, we actually saw that the grandmothers were providing more care and grandfathers were providing dramatically less care. So I'm just going to show this in a little more detail, highlighting relationship status and its effect on caregiving. So here we have probability of providing care for a grandchild, and this is controlling for those things I talked about around resources, age, etc. Grandparents together, we see clearly that grandmothers provide more care than grandfathers. With divorced grandparents, grandmothers increase their care, whereas grandfathers, there's a dramatic drop in caregiving. When grandparents are widowed, the grandmothers look pretty much like grandparents still together, but we see a significant drop for grandfathers. When we have grandparents that remarry, we see that there's a drop for grandmothers and a massive drop for grandfathers. What's interesting is grandfathers invest in their new partner's children much more than grandmothers do when they have a new partner on the scene. So let's look at relationship status in the child protection setting. What I showed you already is that we already see a strong matrilateral bias in grandparenting. But when we break that down by relationship status, we see a nice or an interesting interaction here. If grandparents are together, there's really no matrilateral bias. They are really coming forward the same, whether it's mother's or father's family. When we look at a step grandparent being involved, we start to see the matrilateral bias. And these are probably grandparents who are maybe not as interested in investing in a non-related grandchild. But when we have a grandparent alone, and these are largely alone due to divorce, we see a massive matrilateral bias. And what I think is happening here is that we have increasingly challenging circumstances for these grandparents. You know, I would argue that a grandparent alone has less resources. They tend to be poor, they're on their own, they don't have the support of a partner. Matrilateral family are remaining involved. They're continuing to provide care even in more challenging circumstances. It's not that paternal family are less likely to be divorced. It's that paternal family are less likely to provide care when they are divorced. When I did a comparison of matrilateral versus patrilateral kin, what I found was that they had lower incomes on average, higher rates of unemployment, less education, and more physical and mental health problems. And these were serious problems, things like terminal liver cancer, Alzheimer's disease that was affecting functioning, significant arthritis that affected mobility, all while providing care to quite young children. So these were people who were being quite challenged to provide care, but in matrilateral families, they were coming forward, whereas patrilateral family in that same circumstance, they wouldn't provide care. They wouldn't volunteer to provide support. So some of the key concepts I want to come back
Gretchen, real quick.
Yes.
Sorry, can we go back one slide?
Yes.
There was a question from Dave Gary.
Okay.
A clarification question. Are daughters asking for more support than sons?
That's a complicated question that if I can answer it at the end, I think it's a really interesting, larger discussion that I'd like to highlight. Is that okay?
Great.
Okay. So when we look at the whole issue of bringing theory to practice, what I want to highlight is that often in child protection assessments, but also when social workers and other social service workers are working with families, they don't necessarily highlight these issues. But evolutionary theory would suggest that we should take them into consideration. Things like closeness of relatedness, whether the child care provider is a grandmother or not, whether it's matrilateral or patrilateral family. If there are competitors for care, if we're looking at aunties and uncles, do they have their own children or not? If it's a grandparent, is the grandfather still in the home and does he have high dependency needs? Is the connection of the extended family caregiver to the mother and the child, or both? What's the relationship status? Whether the support will be reciprocated. And this is another important piece in child protection and support environments, where often we look at having wraparound services or family group decision-making conferences where everybody gets together and says, we need to support this family and need to maintain the child in the home. Let's develop a contract and determine who's going to do what to help this family. And everybody signs up. And in 6 months, the whole thing's fallen apart. And often it's because the parents themselves have very limited resources. And the contracts demand that distantly related people or non-family members have to invest a lot, but the parents aren't able to reciprocate anything or very little. And so it burns people out and we have these contracts falling apart. So I think when we look at wraparound and family group decision-making, we need to take into consideration this idea of reciprocation. And one of the other things that I haven't really touched on here is another evolutionary theory around attachment. I think this also needs to be considered, and I'll just briefly acknowledge it as, when a parent or a close family member has ongoing relationship with a child, they develop an attachment, and this can include, non-relatives as well. If they're heavily involved with a child, an evolved adaptation can be engaged here, that we can see that engendering a commitment to the child, and that should be taken into consideration as well. This should not be considered a checklist, though. Sometimes when I review these things, people say, okay, let's look at this as a checklist. We don't want to do this. We want to include it in a nuanced way because we know that there are proximate mediating factors that have important influence as well. And most social workers or social service workers will be attentive to these, the material resources of the family. If we have caregivers have high health needs themselves, we need to take that into consideration. If a grandparent's coming forward and they're in their 60s and they're looking at long-term care of a child, what are they going to look like in their 70s if they're already showing health concerns? For instance, we need to have an understanding of the child. Often we're dealing with high needs children with complex histories. And is there a goodness of fit between the prospective caregiver and the needs of the child? What is that going to look like if we have a child with fetal alcohol today versus when they're in their teen years? Is this family going to be able to navigate that? Is there access to training for complex child needs? And is that going to be equally available to an extended family caregiver or a kin caregiver? Is that going to be available now or into the future? Particularly with adoption, we want to look at supports for those adoptive parents in the long term. And I've talked a lot about culture in terms of cross-cultural universals, this idea of matrilateral bias happening in all of these areas, for instance. What I haven't talked as much about is the complexity and variation. But that does need to be taken into consideration. Just in terms of my example of Bangladesh, women don't always have equal access to their family of origin, but they may need that support, pardon me. We know that in certain circumstances, in many places around the world, at high risk times, mother's family are involved. For instance, when women have their babies, often there's cultural rules that say a woman can get support from her mother rather than her mother-in-law. And that certainly happens in Bangladesh. It also happens in places in Africa where there's expectations that a woman would go back to her mom to provide care. And we see in China an increase in matrilateral family being involved with children as well. But it means taking a nuanced view of culture in these circumstances. But we should also acknowledge that the evolutionary adaptations that I've been talking about can actually set up circumstances for overcommitting. That we talked a bit already about those grandparents that come forward when they have very serious physical and other health issues going on. This sometimes means it raises the question of whether they're actually able to provide legitimate quality care to children with high needs. So we need to look at overcommitment. And this can sometimes lead to breakdown in placements because there isn't a good fit between the high level of care the child needs and the high complexity of the motivated caregiver. So we need to make sure that we're mediating those challenges with high levels of support within the caregiving environment. So to get back to the question, why is NANA a big deal? Grandmothers, especially maternal grandmothers, provide substantial direct care to grandchildren. They provide more intermittent and primary care to grandchildren. And they're committed to, and particularly maternal grandmothers, commit to both the mother and the grandchild. They're highly resilient in their caregiving, and they're associated with better outcomes for children. So I relied on some important research here that people could take a look at if they'd like to, but I'm happy to answer questions. And at this point, I'll go back to Dave Geary's very reasonable question about those caregivers in the child protection setting. Dave, you asked about, is part of the reason so many women's family come forward because the mums are asking for their mums to provide care. Now, this question can be answered within the child protection setting, but also more broadly. At first, I talked about why there would be a matrilateral bias, and I suggested that there would be the matrilateral bias model where inclusive fitness would suggest that there would be a strong relationship between women and mothers and a less strong relationship between women and the mother-in-law. That mother-in-law relationship is going to be more tenuous. And I think that's absolutely the case, that when women are approached in a child protection setting and really any sort of formal resource environment, they're going to say, I want my mom to help me, much more than they're going to say, I want my mother-in-law to help me. But layered on top of that is the bureaucratic process of child protection settings. When a worker is involved with the family, they tend to be involved with mothers because often families need support because of conflict within the nuclear family. Dads are often the person who's engaged in domestic violence or has been the problematic person in the family. He might even be removed from the family. So the worker is engaged with the mom. To a much lesser degree, they're engaged with the dad. So when they ask about who can provide support, often it's the mother who's giving the answer, not the dad. And so the mother's response is the one that's going to be highlighted. So I totally acknowledge that there can be some distortion here because of the process of how child protection work functions. Having said that, there is a really strong shift within child protection that happened in the US at various times, really starting in the 1980s in California, but amplified in the 90s and 2000s pretty much everywhere in the US. Canada was a bit later, looking at it in the 2000s. And in 2006, legislation changed in most places in Canada, saying that child protection agencies had to promote kin as a non-parental placement over any other caregiver. And in Britain and Europe, this happened around really the 90s, 2000s, and the 2010s. What that means is there's a lot of internal structure within those agencies to highlight any kin. So there's much better systems in place than when this research was done to not just look at mom's family, but to look at every family member who might be available. So I suspect that what we're seeing is a legitimate reflection of what we would see, but there is likely to be some distortion. So I realize that's a long-winded answer. I think explains a little bit better of the dynamic of how that works.
Right. What struck me was your slide that showed that divorced grandfathers aren't engaging much with the grandkids, at least at a significant level. But when they were, it was almost always with their daughters.
Yes.
Not with their sons.
Yeah. And so there does seem to be, and from my experience in working with those families, with the child protection data, I had been the sole kin assessor for that agency for about 8 years. And in addition to that, the previous 10 years, I had been a frontline child protection worker or supervisor, as well as in charge for a period of time of all the access visits that happened in that agency. I was in a number of different roles. So I knew firsthand most of those families, probably 80 to 90% of the families in that data set I knew personally. And I know from that experience that when grandfathers were providing care, it was almost exclusively to their daughter's children. It was almost never to their son's children. Yeah. In fact, I can't think of an example.
Great. Before we take questions, I wanted to just thank Gretchen for joining. So if everyone can unmic and give her a round of applause. Thank you. Great. We have plenty of
great
time.
Talk.
Yeah. We have plenty of time for questions, so please jump in. You can either use the chat feature or raise your hand or just start speaking. Totally up to you.
Okay. And I would just mention that my email is there. So if people do want to connect with me, if you have questions that come up for you later, I'm happy to communicate with people that way.
First question is from Andre Arya. He's in the Department of Philosophy. Andre?
I kind of hesitate to start. I didn't really want to start the questioning this way because I'm a philosopher, so I might ask questions that seem out from left field.
Oh, no, that's fine.
So one of our primary interests in this evolution of social sciences is to try to get people to be more, people from different disciplines to be more amenable to understanding evolutionary explanations. So this is in that spirit, to try to choose our concepts and our terms and such that we can bring people into the fore to see the great value added that evolutionary theory can offer. So I'm doing all this couching because I don't want this to sound contentious at all. Okay. And so the question has to do with the concept of adaptation. So
Sure.
Oftentimes the literature that you cited talks about that this maternal effect that you're seeing, this bias, is an adaptation. Let me just start by asking Blanket, what do you mean by an adaptation? I mean, there's a hook to this, right? Because we have to be careful.
Yeah. And this gets really tricky. So I think that for me, in presenting this talk, I was much more heavy with theory, perhaps more so than some people would like, but it was because of the particular audience. When I talk about this in the social work environment, when I'm teaching students, I don't talk about adaptation because they don't know how to approach it. They don't have a background in evolutionary theory to be able to grasp that. So when I talk about adaptation, I'm not just talking about a theoretical approach where, for instance, with the matrilateral bias, I'm proposing here that it is reasonable to think human beings have evolved because of these evolutionary pressures that could have resulted in this developing, meaning mom being more willing to support her daughter than mother-in-law supporting her daughter. But when it comes to how I talk to my students or fellow colleagues, I'm not really concerned about those ultimate questions because it's too remote. They can't relate to that, and it seems abstract. What they really need to know about is, do we see this in real life? I'm giving an potential explanation why there's a difference between mothers and mothers-in-law and their investment in a woman and her children. But at the end of the day, I have to back that up with the types of things I talked about here of, do we actually see it? If it's an adaptation, we would expect to see it cross-culturally in that wide variation around the world in these very different contexts. Do we still see a consistent pattern of mom's relatives providing more care than dad's relatives, that mom investing in her daughter versus mother-in-law investing in her daughter? So when I talk about adaptation, I'm talking about what are the evolutionary mechanisms that might have evolved to see this pattern, but I have to clearly anchor it in being able to demonstrate the pattern is there in a cross-cultural way. And that's where, in a sense, I get the hook. And that's why in my last 3 slides, the third from the last, I identify when we're looking at assessments or how we might support family, these are the evolutionary supported items like grandmothers, matrilateral family, things of that nature, that might not be highlighted when social workers or other sort of practical workers are working with the family. But I'm just sort of saying, do acknowledge these because there's likely to be strong effect from these particular variables. But I also then temper it with the very proximate issues of income and so on and so forth. Does that answer your question?
Yeah,
Or,
so I mean, oh, absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah.
But if you don't mind a little bit of a follow-up. So it just
Sure.
seems that when and this is us, I'm included in this. When we talk about evolutionary explanations, we're not really you're not showing that this is an adaptation, because an adaptation, first of all, has a kind of connotation of a design. And that also has a connotation about something about being fixed in a population, because the phenomenon that you found is a bias, right? Not every grandmother has this. You didn't see the effect universally at all. You see a bias. So, right. So you can choose to explain why, right. The average you can explain the bias, but you can also ask of the data, why isn't it universal? Right. And it seems to me that any notion of adaptation doesn't allow us to have room for talking about the fact that some grandmothers don't have those effects. And sometimes it's actually quite a great variation effect.
Well, there's, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Dave.
Yeah. Well, there's a difference. If we look at paternal investment as analogously, across species, in some cases it is obligate, meaning that the dad needs to be there in order for the offspring to survive, and that's kind of what you're suggesting is an adaptation. But in other contexts, paternal investment is facultatively expressed. It depends on context or not, and that is also an adaptation, but it is influenced by contextual factors, and you can study and predict what those factors might be. So there's some plasticity in there, but it's not random. There are things that predict when, if and when and how much it will occur, and that's an adaptation too.
Right. I would just add that any adaptive plasticity would appear to be, the frequency would be somewhere between 0 and 1, precisely for the reasons that unless you manipulated the environment such that every organism faced the exact same environment, then you could push it to the point at which everybody expresses it. But if this adaptation, if this plasticity is adapted to variable environments, and the environments are variable in the ways that they were selected against, then you would get you'd get what would look like a bias rather than fixation. At least that's how I tend to think of it.
Yeah. And I would agree with Dave and Karthik on this, that I don't feel like an adaptation has to be absolutely universal in every single context to be an adaptation. I think that particularly in human beings, where we succeed and proliferate and are so effective in such extremely wide environments and circumstances, that you're more likely perhaps even to see biases and adaptations, that these adaptations, because they're confronting such extreme variation, that you would perhaps more likely see adaptations that, particularly behavioral ones like this, coming up with, facultative responses. Yeah, I'm not describing that well, but
I can just follow up.
Yeah, real quick. We have a couple of other questions, but go ahead, Andre, real quick.
Oh, no. I'm okay. It's obviously.
No, if you have a quick follow-up, go ahead.
Oh, okay. It's just that there's an ambiguity in the term, right? So there's adaptations. This is what came out of the discussion. I'm just wrapping up. I don't know much about this, but there seems to be two kinds of concepts. One's a population level concept. You're explaining a bias in a population. And then second, there's a token level concept. And it's probably a good idea, if we're going to be more inclusive and get people more interested in what we're doing and seeing the value added by giving an evolutionary theory, that we're really careful. And I mean, I'm not telling you this. I'm summarizing what I just heard, what you just told me. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah.
We have a question from Colleen Colliner. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, a professor in the Department of Communication. And the question is about, which is something you hinted at in one of your slides, about adoptions. So would the kinds of relationships that you see be paralleled with mothers who adopt their children? And then I think, if I'm interpreting correctly, would the grandmother in this situation, so the mother of the adopting mother, how would she treat her adopted grandchildren? So if you could speak a little bit more broadly about adoption.
Yeah, and I didn't touch on adoption really at all in this circumstance, except for what Colleen has identified. And it's really a huge topic area. I'll just give a little bit of perspective on that. First off, the whole idea of stranger adoption that we have in the West is pretty peculiar and is a fairly modern development in human behavior. This is not something that has typically happened. And I think my understanding of it is that, when I was showing those slides about our emotional responses to the different pictures of the babies, human beings have a high level of empathy. And when it comes to babies, we have sort of a baseline response to children. We have baseline impetus to have children ourselves. Again, this may not be the hard and fast adaptation that Andre is looking for, but generally speaking, we have this sense of wanting to have kids and having very warm feelings about the idea of wanting to care for children. For some people, that's really high. And in that perspective, there's an interest in adopting. In historical or previous environments or traditional societies before sort of formal state societies and so on and so forth, when adoption was occurring, there were lots of circumstances where children's parents weren't available or couldn't care for kids. What happened in those circumstances is that the primary person to come forward to provide care was maternal grandmother. And cultures actually identified the maternal grandmother is the person who should provide care to those children in need. And certainly there's a number of different cultures where maternal grandmother is the one to actually take the first child that's born to a woman. In many places, the first child a woman has might be to a partner that's different from the partner of her subsequent children. And so maternal grandmothers are the first person to really come to the fore with that. When we look at cross-cultural work, Joan Silk had done a really great review back in 1980, which she updated in 1990 as well, looking at this cross-culturally. It's maternal grandmothers, then we see aunts and uncles, and the same pattern that I talked about in terms of caregiving, my slides, occurring in adoption. Interesting is that with these different scenarios, typically if parents are alive, they remain involved, that the idea of adoption is somewhat different than the adoption we have that has been the modern concept of adoption, where children are moved and shifted to a whole other family and have quite a separated relationship with their birth families. Now that's starting to be tempered with open adoptions today, but that's, again, very, very new. But historically, adoptions would have, if the parents were still alive, the parents would still have some understanding of that child in their life. People would know, the child would know who their birth parents were. And often the birth parents would have the authority to say, if you're mistreating my child, I can bring them back to my care. So we see very similar patterns in adoption in evolutionary times and historical times that we might see today. Does that answer the question?
I think so. We have another question from, oh, sorry. We have another question from Mary Horde. How is the matrilineal bias expressed in patrilocal societies? I think you touched on this during the Bangladesh segment.
Yeah, so in Bangladesh, one of the things that's quite interesting,
and sorry, just real quick, just so that everybody who's not an anthropologist is on board, can you also just redefine matrilineal and patrilocal?
Sorry. So when we're talking about matra or patrilocal, it's where people are residing after marriage, basically. And patrilineal or patrilineal, matrilineal or patrilineal is descent lines, how you track things like inheritance. If it's matrilineal, you would inherit from your mother's side. If it's patrilineal, you inherit from father's side. So in Bangladesh, it's both matrilineal and patrilineal and patrilocal. Sorry, I'm losing my train of thought. The fight is this. It's now 6:15 in the morning, and I'm losing track. So the question was about
matrilineal societies, but patrilocal residents.
Yeah. Okay, so when we're looking at patrilocal environments, one of the interesting things is that in high-risk times for women and children, there seem to be things in place that women can reconnect with their family of origin. So in Bangladesh, as an example, when women are pregnant and have their children soon after birth, they often move back to their family of origin. So women will have to get permission from their mother-in-law, but most mother-in-laws do give permission for women to move back to their mom's home, and they co-reside with her, usually at the end or late stages of her pregnancy, and sometimes upwards of a year, they remain at their mom's home, getting that care and support. And women's sort of description of this is a few things. One is they want to go home because they'll get more nurturing care from their mom. And for the mother-in-laws, they're seeing that family compound not just as a home where people raise kids, but also an economic unit where people are working in the Bari to support and provide resources for this extended family. When women are in their late pregnancy and soon after their children are born, they're not as effective at being able to contribute. So a lot of those mother-in-laws are happy for the women to go back to their own mom to get care and support. And what we find is that those children are more likely to survive and thrive with the support of their moms rather than the mother-in-law. When we look at other circumstances, certainly there's been research done in Africa where certain groups there that are quite strongly patrilineal and patrilocal, again, at that time of late pregnancy and soon after birth, women are returning home. We see in China this shift, certainly Confucianism has stamped a strong patrilineal, patrilocal stamp on how things function in China. But we see that at these high needs times in women's lives, that in fact, mom's side of the family become very important. We also see in these environments that in ongoing ways, women might be more physically distant from their mother's side of the family. But those mother's side of the family still contribute in other ways. So in Bangladesh, the person who is likely to provide the most material resources, so not direct childcare, but material resources, was mom's brother. She wasn't living with him, but he was providing sometimes essential resources around healthcare, education, things like that. And we see that in other places as well, that they might not be providing support in terms of direct childcare because the proximity impairs that, but they're actually providing material resources that still provide important support. So there are ways of families getting around challenging times in families' lives that promote the important help that matrilateral family or mother's side of the family can provide.
All right, we have another question from Joshua Rust.
Hi, thanks for this talk. It's so interesting. My wife's a social worker. She was a social worker in California for 10 years. So I spent the last hour like texting her nuggets from your talk. All of the points she enthusiastically endorsed. And reflect her own experience as well. In fact, she said in California, you noted that California took the lead in trying to place kids with kin rather than non-relatives, and she noted that like one of the problems was often there was criminal background checks for obstacles to doing this, and they would be going to like the social workers would go to judges to overturn these things. That they would rather place these kids with family members that had criminal background difficulties than with non-parents. I mean,
yeah,
so it's just so interesting. Anyway, yeah. So as far as my question goes, and I might have misunderstood you or misheard you, so that might be the problem here. But at one point in the talk, you said that after pointing out that grandparents and aunts and uncles and other relatives tend to care more than other classes of non-parents. You said that this quote shows support for the evolutionary perspective, and I see that that it does show support, as for the in terms of inclusive fitness. I see where you're going with that. But the way of phrasing it seems to suggest that friends or formal childcare providers, non-relatives, that their care can't be understood from an evolutionary perspective. So what do you think? I mean, does the evolutionary perspective only?
Yeah, no. I may have not expressed myself especially well, but on the slide that I talk about extended family caregiving, step parents, and friends, I am talking about other evolutionarily supported mechanisms, like with step parenting, stepfathers, and stepmothers do provide a lot of care to children. And they do have an impact on child well-being. but it's the mechanism is related to benefits in terms of mating strategy, more the mechanism there, not inclusive fitness. So on that slide, I was just trying to identify these are other adaptive ways of getting at the same response, meaning these people also do provide care.
Yeah, good.
Is different. And so reciprocity in terms of friends and other caregivers was a third one.
Good. Okay, that makes sense. Yeah. Thank you.
All right, we have a few more minutes if anybody else has a question or comment. The criticisms are also welcome. And it's 6:30 in the morning for her, so she really can't fire back very aggressively.
I'm in a weakened state, Karthik. Although I must admit that, being in academia in a social work department where people don't have a great understanding of this stuff, I'm used to getting challenged fairly regularly. But what usually gets people is what Joshua talked about, is that when people actually are social workers and work with families, we come to the same endpoint, that we're seeing the same things happening. So the lived experience of social work reinforces what I'm talking about.
I have a question.
All right, this is Jake Young, a former Mizzou PhD student, now Dr. Jake Young, English, right? English and poetry?
Yep.
Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, kind of combining lines of thought that Andre presented and Josh just presented. I'm curious, when I think of evolutionary explanations, often that has to do more along the lines of genetic adaptations, but clearly this is more along the lines of social adaptations, cultural adaptations. I'm just curious if there's any literature out there that talks about evidence in the archaeological record about perhaps group size or something like that, about when this type of behavior might have arisen.
Well, that's not an area of specialty for me, so I'm not going to be able to give you a sophisticated answer, to be honest. But I think when we look at the environment within which human beings have evolved, what we see is that there are multi-family small groups of closely related people living together. And there certainly is a lot of evidence for that environment. And I referred to that very briefly. So certainly in terms of that context, that's the environment within which human beings have evolved. That's the context within which we're likely to have parents would have gotten the most support from those aunts and uncles and other extended family members. So I think that's the context. There would be certainly an abundance of archaeological evidence to support that. But that's not an area of focus that I've really worked within.
Can I add to that, Gretchen, if you don't mind?
Sure.
What I would probably say is not the archaeology, but the paleontology is going to give us a good bet, some inferences there where around 2 million years ago, you really do see a massive reduction in sexual dimorphism between males and females. You see the brain sizes of babies increase quite a lot, and we really deviate away from the ape pattern around 2 million years ago. And it's likely that a female giving birth to a baby with a brain that large would not have been able to support that child on her own. And so at least, and this is coincident with the rise of hunting. So at least you've probably got males provisioning, and then you might also have, with this reduction in sexual dimorphism, you might have something like the kind of family arrangements. It's circumstantial, but it's consistent. Dave Geary probably knows even more about it, but that's how I would probably respond to that kind of a question.
Thank you.
Thank you, Karthik.
Anybody else? Last question, or two short ones?
I think Sukhvinder has her hand.
I didn't see that. Okay, Sukhvinder.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Please.
Hi. I was just adding to what Karthik was saying. I thought the answers would also lie in paleoanthropology, especially your hypothesis, the grandmother hypothesis, consistent with Dunbar number suggestion that when the group exceeds a certain number, then there are enough elders or people who don't have dependent children to support young ones. So there's an extended time of maturity for humans that you don't see in any other hominid, including Neanderthal before that. So I thought that was interesting, and that supported what you were saying with the grandmother hypothesis.
Thank you. That's actually very helpful. It's good for me to have these open discussions like this. It adds to my kete.
Great. If there's anybody else, we have time for one quick question. If not, I'll probably stop the recording. Okay. Well, again, thanks so much, Gretchen. If you don't mind hanging in, I'd like to catch up with you, but
yes,
I'm going to stop the recording.
That would be great.
Yeah, great job, Gretchen. Very, very interesting talk.
Thank you. Wonderful to see you again, Dave, too.
Yep. Yeah, great to see you.
Thanks, everybody, for tuning in and taking part. It's a great discussion.